Hi, welcome, and good evening. Tonight, we drift gently back through time to explore a surprisingly curious habit. Something that may sound a bit uncomfortable, even strange, to our modern ears. It's the old practice of sleeping not lying down, but sitting up, propped at an angle, cradled by pillows or bolsters, sometimes in a wooden bed with a backrest, other times in a chair beside the fire. Yes, once upon a time, sleeping upright was not unusual. In fact, it was sometimes preferred. Why would anyone choose to sleep that way? Was it medical advice? Or fear of something unseen? What were the beds like in those days? What did people believe about sleep, posture, and even demons? In this slow, quiet journey, we'll explore medieval bedrooms, the ideas and fears people carried into the night, and how history shaped the very way we rest our heads. So now, make yourself comfortable. Let the thoughts of the day melt away. And gently, let's begin. When we think of sleep today, we usually imagine a soft, flat bed. Perhaps a deep mattress, a cozy duvet tucked around us, and a pillow cradling our head. For many people in the modern world, this is the default, a horizontal bed, placed in a quiet, dark room. But for much of human history, that image would have seemed unfamiliar, even strange. In the past, the shape of sleep, both literally and culturally, was very different. Let us begin in the late Middle Ages, a time before electricity, before central heating, and long before the idea of sleep hygiene. Life was organized around natural light and the rhythms of the sun. When night fell, work ended. People relied on candles, oil lamps, and the hearth for visibility. And sleep came earlier, not because people were more tired, necessarily, but because there was little else to do in the darkness. But how did they sleep? Historical texts, illustrations, and furniture surviving from this period tell a fascinating story. While wealthy households had large wooden bed frames, often grand, carved, and enclosed by heavy curtains, most people slept on simpler arrangements. A mattress, if they had one, was filled with straw, reeds, or feathers, laid on wooden slats or a rope lattice. Poorer folk might use pallets on the floor, or even beds made from bundles of rushes beside the fire. Yet no matter the materials, one detail stands out. People often slept at an angle, not lying flat on their backs, but propped up, halfway between sitting and reclining. They used large bolsters, firm pillows, and sometimes even sloped bed frames to keep their upper bodies raised. This was not a matter of chance or discomfort. It was an intentional practice, and one widely accepted as normal. This practice may seem odd to us today, but in the Middle Ages, there were several good reasons for it. One was practicality. In a time when central heating did not exist, warmth was a constant concern. Being closer to the fire, or remaining slightly upright, helped retain body heat. Sitting up also allowed people to remain alert, helpful in households where multiple people might share a bed, or where domestic tasks, such as tending to a fire or soothing a child, required attention in the night. But there was also the matter of health. Medieval medical theory, still deeply influenced by ancient Greek and Roman ideas, held that the body's internal balance was delicate. Physicians believed in the concept of the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Each person had a unique mixture of these fluids, and illness was thought to arise when the humors were out of balance. According to these theories, posture had a direct impact on health. Lying flat was thought to cause the humors to pool in the wrong places, particularly in the head and chest. It could bring on headaches, coughing, or a heavy feeling in the limbs. For this reason, many people chose to sleep propped up, believing it would aid breathing and digestion, and prevent the dreaded vapors, foul gases thought to rise from the stomach and cloud the mind. Indeed, many historical medical guides recommended elevated sleeping, particularly for people who were ill. The Regimen Sanitatis Salernitanum, a widely read medieval health manual, advised sleeping on the right side and with the head raised, to allow the stomach to digest properly. The advice was both preventative and therapeutic. If you had a cold, trouble breathing, or weak digestion, you were told to sleep upright. But sleep was not only about the body, it also concerned the soul. In many Christian traditions, sleep was seen as a time when the soul temporarily left the body and drifted into a dream world. Dreams could be spiritual, visions from God, or dangerous temptations. Lying down too flat, or sleeping too deeply, might open the door to unwanted spiritual influence. Some people feared that lying flat mimicked the position of death, arms at the sides, back on the ground, eyes closed in stillness. To sleep in this way was, in a sense, to invite death, or to tempt the spirits of the underworld. Sleeping upright, by contrast, was a symbol of readiness, to pray, to rise, or to resist temptation. In monasteries, monks sometimes slept sitting in wooden choir stalls. These were not comfortable places to lie down, and nor were they meant to be. The idea was to sleep lightly, never fully giving in to the body's desires. Being able to rouse oneself quickly for prayers in the early hours was considered a spiritual discipline. In this way, sleep posture was closely tied to religious values, humility, self-control, and wakefulness before God. Even outside monasteries, nighttime was not a time of total rest. In households, people often divided their sleep into two parts, what we now call segmented sleep. They would go to bed after sundown, sleep for a few hours, then wake up around midnight. This wakeful period might be used for prayer, quiet conversation, even minor chores. After an hour or two, they would return to bed and sleep until dawn. Sleeping at an angle made these interruptions easier. Instead of dragging oneself from deep, flat slumber, it was easier to rouse from a reclining or sitting position. It allowed the sleeper to move from sleep to wakefulness, and back again, with less strain. Thus, the shape of sleep in the past was different not just in form, but in rhythm. Beds were shared, dreams were meaningful, the night was active. People went to sleep earlier, but not always for longer. They feared illness and spirits, and they trusted posture as both a spiritual shield and a medical precaution. All of this shaped the way beds were built. Furniture makers created bed frames with high, angled headboards. Bolsters were sold in markets alongside rushes and feathers. Pillows were firmer, often rectangular rather than square, and designed for upright support. Over time, as medical theory evolved and cultural beliefs shifted, the fully flat bed became standard. But even into the 18th and 19th centuries, people, especially the elderly and infirm, continued to sleep upright. It was a habit shaped by centuries of tradition, and one that lingered quietly in the shadows of history. So the next time you lie down to sleep, consider the generations before you, not stretched out as we are now, but sitting half awake, eyes flickering in the candlelight, trusting that their angled position might just keep the night's dangers at bay. To understand why people in the past slept sitting up, we need to look more closely at the beds themselves. Beds are more than just a place to rest. They are a reflection of the time, the culture, and the concerns of the people who sleep in them. In the medieval world, beds varied greatly depending on wealth, status, and region. For the poor, a bed might be no more than a simple wooden bench, or even a heap of straw on the floor, covered with coarse cloth or animal skins. But for those of higher rank, nobles, merchants, or prosperous farmers, the bed was a prized piece of furniture, and often the most expensive item in the home. Let's imagine a bedchamber in a 15th century manor house. The room is dark, illuminated only by the soft orange glow of a fire and the flicker of a tallow candle. In one corner stands a large bed, high off the ground, its frame carved from oak or walnut, sturdy and ornate. For thick posts rise at each corner, supporting a canopy overhead. Heavy curtains hang down, ready to be drawn shut for warmth and privacy. But look closely, and you'll notice something curious. The bed is not completely flat. The head of the bed is slightly raised, and the pillows are piled high. This slanted posture was not accidental. It was by design. Beds were often built with an inclined headboard, angled just enough to support the sleeper in a semi-reclined position. Mattresses could be shaped or adjusted to enhance this angle, and sleeping pillows were firmer than those we use today, intended to support the back and neck while remaining upright. In some homes, especially in colder regions, beds were also built near the hearth. The proximity to the fire helped keep the sleeper warm, and the warmth was thought to be beneficial to health. But it also meant that sitting up made it easier to tend the fire during the night without fully rising from bed. Poorer families who could not afford full beds sometimes used sloped wooden benches, angled slightly so that a person could rest against the backboard. Others slept on bed boxes, large wooden chests with lids that could be used as makeshift sleeping surfaces. These could be propped open to create a kind of recliner, useful for those who preferred to rest with their head raised. In fact, many households shared sleeping space. A bed might hold not just a husband and wife, but their children, or even a servant. Sitting up offered more space, and helped to avoid the awkwardness of lying shoulder to shoulder in close quarters. It also helped sleepers avoid bumping into one another too easily during the night. The rich had more choices. They could afford feather beds, thick mattresses stuffed with feathers or wool, layered on top of firmer bases made of straw or horsehair. To help maintain the inclined position, they used large bolsters, long, cylindrical pillows that propped up the torso. In many illustrations from the time, we can see figures reclining in bed with their backs lifted, arms resting comfortably, not quite lying down but not fully upright either, somewhere in between. This semi-seated posture was not only more practical but also more fashionable. In elite households, the bed was not simply for sleep, it was also a place to receive visitors. Important guests might be invited to speak with the lady of the house while she reclined on her bed, dressed in her dayrobe, supported by cushions. Letters might be written, children might be nursed, or stories read aloud, all while reclining in bed. In this sense, the bed functioned more like a sofa or lounge chair, a multi-purpose piece of furniture central to domestic life. And so, beds were constructed not merely for sleeping, but for sitting, reclining, nursing, praying, and conversing. Their form followed their function, and their shape, sloped, high-backed, and enclosed, supported the upright sleeping posture that was both normal and desirable. Interestingly, bed curtains also played a part in posture. When drawn shut, these heavy curtains helped retain heat, but they also restricted space. In smaller beds, lying flat might feel cramped within the curtained enclosure. Sitting or reclining allowed for more comfortable use of the space, while still retaining warmth and privacy. Beyond the home, similar patterns can be seen in institutions. Hospitals, monasteries, and boarding schools all used simple beds that often supported upright sleep. In monasteries, monks slept in individual stalls, much like choir pews, with small wooden armrests and slanted backs. These were not intended for deep, flat rest. Rather, they were designed for short, disciplined slumber between prayer sessions. In hospitals, inclined beds helped patients breathe more easily. The association between elevated posture and better breathing was well understood, even without modern science. People noticed that sleeping upright helped with chest illnesses, coughing, or congestion. Doctors and caretakers adjusted beds with boards or pillows to support the body, often raising the head significantly higher than the feet. The materials used to construct beds also tell us about their intended use. Rope beds, common in the 16th and 17th centuries, had frames laced with tightly stretched ropes instead of slats or boards. These ropes could be adjusted for tension, allowing the bed to be firmer or softer, or to tilt slightly upwards. A loose rope might sag in the middle, but a tightly pulled one would support a firm incline. The phrase "sleep tight" actually originates from this practice. It refers to tightening the ropes of the bed to create a firm, supportive surface. Eventually, by the 18th and 19th centuries, bed design began to shift. Mattresses grew thicker and more cushioned, headboards became less inclined, and sleeping fully flat became more fashionable. But for many generations, the idea of lying completely flat was not just unusual, it was avoided. Thus, the construction of beds in the past was a direct reflection of how people believed sleep should happen. Upright or angled, enclosed or open, soft or firm. Each choice was made to support not only comfort, but health, practicality, and even spiritual safety. To sleep sitting up may seem odd to us now, but it made perfect sense to those who lived by candlelight, feared nighttime illnesses, and viewed the bed as much more than just a place to rest. To understand why so many people in the past slept sitting up, we must take a quiet step into the world of medieval and early modern medicine. A world that viewed the body not through microscopes or scans, but through humors, vapors, and carefully observed habits. In that world, posture mattered deeply. From ancient Greece to late medieval Europe, medicine was dominated by a theory known as the humoral system. Developed most notably by the Greek physician Hippocrates, and later refined by Galen, this system taught that the human body contained four essential fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Health, it was believed, came from the balance of these humors. Illness, on the other hand, was the result of an imbalance, too much of one humor, or not enough of another. This belief influenced everything, from diet and bathing, to exercise and, yes, sleep. Lying down completely flat was thought to cause the humors to settle improperly. If a person lay too long on their back, it was believed that phlegm might collect in the lungs, or that vapors might rise from the stomach into the head, causing dizziness, nightmares, or worse, a suffocation of the heart. In this context, sleeping with the upper body elevated became a matter of health and protection. Medical texts from the Middle Ages offer advice that seems oddly specific today. Many recommend sleeping on the right side, with the head raised slightly above the chest, and the knees slightly bent. These details were thought to encourage good digestion, steady breathing, and clear-headedness upon waking. One of the most widely read medical manuals in medieval Europe, the Regimen Sanitatis Salonitanum, written in Latin verse in the 12th century, advises, "Let not the head too low in slumber lie, lest vapors rising cloud the memory." This rhyme reflects a real concern of the time, that lying flat allowed noxious vapors, believed to rise from undigested food, to enter the head and disrupt thought, cause confusion, or lead to melancholy. In contrast, sleeping upright was thought to help the body digest, as food would move more easily through the stomach when the torso was slightly raised. This was especially important at night, when digestion was thought to slow down. People believed that if one went to bed too soon after eating, or lay too flat, undigested food would rot inside the stomach, producing gases, causing discomfort, and even attracting malevolent forces. Medical thought also warned against flat sleeping for people suffering from certain conditions. Those with chest ailments, coughs, or weak hearts were advised to sleep with their heads raised. The goal was to ease the weight on the lungs and heart, and to help air flow freely through the body during sleep. And it wasn't just words. Doctors acted on these beliefs. Beds were designed and arranged to allow the head and back to rest at an angle. Bolsters, firm, cylindrical pillows, were used to elevate the upper body, especially during times of illness. If someone was suffering from fever, chills, or shortness of breath, they would be made to sleep upright, either in bed or even sitting in a chair propped with cushions. One curious belief that continued well into the 17th century was the idea that sleeping flat increased the risk of stroke or paralysis. Some physicians claimed that humors could flood the brain during deep sleep if one lay entirely horizontal. As a precaution, people, especially the elderly or infirm, were instructed to keep the upper body inclined during sleep. Even in pregnancy, posture was considered essential. Women were told to sleep at an angle, so that the womb would remain in the correct position, and to avoid lying flat on the back, lest the weight of the baby cause the internal organs to become misaligned. Then there were the effects of air itself. In the days before germ theory, illness was thought to spread through bad air, or miasma. This air was believed to sink low to the ground during the night. Sleeping too close to the earth, or too flat on one's back, could expose a person to this unhealthy atmosphere. Being raised above it, even just a little, was seen as a shield against illness. In plague times, this belief became especially urgent. Physicians wore beaked masks filled with herbs to filter the air, and households were advised to sleep high above the floor, with heads elevated. Vapors, it was thought, moved differently depending on posture. These practices didn't entirely vanish with the Renaissance. Even as new ideas about the body emerged, the habit of sleeping at an angle persisted. In the 18th and 19th centuries, many people still believed that sleeping flat could lead to congestion, a vague term that referred to blocked airways, excess fluid in the lungs, or a heavy, oppressive feeling in the chest. Books like Domestic Medicine by William Buchan, first published in 1769, offered practical advice to families. Buchan wrote, "Let those with tender lungs or feeble constitutions avoid lying too low during sleep. A bolstered position aids the breath and lightens the chest." In hospitals, particularly in the treatment of tuberculosis, beds were frequently adjusted to support a seated or inclined posture. Doctors observed that patients coughed less and rested better when upright. It was one of the few treatments available for such conditions at the time. Even today, some echoes of these ideas remain. People with acid reflux, sleep apnea, or respiratory issues are often told to sleep with their upper body elevated. Hospitals continue to use adjustable beds. The language of sleeping position is still present in modern medical advice, particularly for infants and older adults. What's remarkable is how deeply these old beliefs shaped the very furniture of sleep. Beds were crafted with sloping headboards, chairs were adapted for nighttime rest, and even cradles for infants were often angled. Sleep was not a passive state. It was a delicate medical event, requiring proper posture, correct alignment, and constant awareness of the body's inner balance. So when we read of people in centuries past sleeping sitting up, it was not always out of fear or discomfort. Often, it was simply following the best medical wisdom of the time. A quiet belief that posture could protect you, that a slanted spine might help your blood and breath flow just a little more easily. And in that small comfort, across countless quiet nights, people drifted off to sleep, not lying down flat, but propped gently against a cushion, trusting that they were sleeping just as they ought to. In the deep stillness of the medieval night, when the fire had burned low and the wind pressed gently against the shutters, sleep did not always come peacefully. For people in centuries past, bedtime was not only a moment of physical rest, it was a spiritual crossing. A time of vulnerability, when the body weakened and the soul, they believed, might slip somewhere else entirely. To lie down fully, stretched out flat, motionless in darkness, invited unease. For some, it was not merely uncomfortable. It was dangerous. Why? Because for many, sleep resembled death. And in a world shaped by religion, superstition, and fear of the unknown, anything that mimicked death too closely was treated with caution. Sleep and the shadow of death. In both religious thought and folk belief, sleep and death were siblings, different states, but similar in form. The Bible often referred to death as a kind of sleep. He slept with his fathers, the texts would say, meaning someone had passed away. And just as death involved the soul leaving the body, it was believed that sleep, too, allowed the soul to wander, to drift, to dream, to visit other realms. Some theologians and mystics believed that during deep sleep, the soul ascended to the heavens, or was temporarily vulnerable to evil spirits. Dreams might be messages from angels, or whispers from demons. To lie down flat, in total stillness, arms by one's sides, was to take the same position as the dead laid out for burial. In fact, people were often buried in their bedsheets, literally laid to rest in the posture of eternal sleep. Because of this, many feared that sleeping in the same position as a corpse might confuse the spirits, or worse, confuse death itself. What if, they wondered, the angel of death mistook a sleeper for someone ready to be taken? And so, to sleep sitting up, or at least partially upright, was a way of saying, I am not ready. I am still living. I am still watchful. Demons in the dark. Sleep was also seen as a moment of spiritual risk. In many traditions, it was believed that demons or dark spirits could attack the sleeper, especially in the dead of night. These beings could creep into a room unnoticed, sit on a person's chest, steal their breath, or tempt them with sinful dreams. This belief appears across cultures and times. In medieval Europe, there were tales of the night hag, a demonic figure that would sit on the chest of a sleeper, paralyzing them, pressing the air from their lungs, and filling their mind with terror. Today, we might recognize this as a form of sleep paralysis, but at the time, it was interpreted as a literal attack by a supernatural being. One 16th century physician described the condition this way: a devil falleth upon men as they sleep, oppresseth them sore, and strangleth them, so that they can neither cry nor stir. Sleeping upright, it was thought, helped prevent such visitations. Sitting up discouraged the demon's grip and kept the chest clear. It also meant the sleeper was less likely to fall into the deep, immobile state in which such attacks occurred. Some people even refused to lie down entirely, especially if they were sick or nearing death. There are historical records of people who insisted on sleeping in chairs, or sitting in bed with their back propped firmly, out of fear that they might die in their sleep, or be claimed by something waiting in the dark. Monastic vigilance. Religious figures, especially monks and nuns, approached sleep with an entirely different mindset. In many monastic communities, sleep was seen as a distraction from spiritual duty, and too much of it was frowned upon. Monks in medieval monasteries were expected to wake several times during the night to pray. These midnight vigils were part of the sacred rhythm of the day, known as the divine office. Because of this, monks often slept in wooden choir stalls, sitting up, fully clothed, with only a cloak for warmth. These stalls were stiff and narrow, designed to discourage indulgent sleep. The goal was to sleep lightly and with discipline, so that when the bell tolled for matins or lauds, prayers at 2 or 3 in the morning, the monks could rise instantly, ready to chant and reflect. In this way, upright sleeping became a symbol of spiritual vigilance. To lie flat was to surrender. To sit up was to remain aware, prepared, attentive to God. Even in lay households, religious people sometimes adopted similar habits. The devout might sleep at an angle to prevent dreaming, which was considered dangerous or indulgent. Others believed that the soul, if kept alert in posture, would be less likely to wander into temptation. Burial beds and the fear of dying in sleep. In earlier centuries, death often came quietly, in the night. Medical care was limited, and illness could take a fatal turn while a person slept. Because of this, people feared dying unnoticed, especially in bed. Some beds were even made to resemble coffins, narrow, enclosed, with high wooden sides, not because people wanted to be reminded of death, but because of the practical overlap between where one slept and where one might eventually be prepared for burial. To sleep flat, then, was not only uncomfortable for some, it was an unsettling reminder. In times of plague, war, or famine, death was always close. Anything that felt too final, too still, too much like the grave, was treated with superstition. Sitting up was a gesture of resistance, a way to remain, however subtly, among the living. Rituals for safer sleep. To guard against these spiritual dangers, people developed nighttime rituals. They might place iron objects, such as scissors or nails, under the pillow to ward off evil. They might sleep with rosary beads or keep a small crucifix near the bed. Some used protective charms, written prayers, or holy water sprinkled around the room. Others drew small symbols in chalk above the door to keep spirits at bay. The position of the bed also mattered. Many refused to sleep with their heads pointing north, as that was associated with burial orientation. Others kept the bed elevated or angled to avoid certain alignments believed to attract demons. In this context, posture was not merely physical, it was part of a wider spiritual defense system. Sleeping upright meant staying above danger, keeping the chest open, and showing the spirit world, I am still awake, still here, still guarded. A lingering unease. Though modern science no longer sees sleep as a time of spiritual danger, some of these old fears still echo in our language and traditions. We speak of sleeping like the dead, of resting in peace, or of someone passing in their sleep. We still lie our dead flat in coffins, hands folded, eyes closed, just as people once feared doing in their own sleep. And while most of us no longer worry about demons in the dark, there is still something about lying down in total stillness that feels, for some, unnervingly vulnerable. Perhaps this is why, even now, people recovering from illness, grieving a loss, or feeling deeply anxious often choose to sleep sitting up. Perhaps it is not just comfort, but instinct. A very old instinct, passed quietly through generations. If you've ever woken up in the middle of the night and found yourself wide awake, mind wandering, hours before dawn, you might have worried that something was wrong. But what if, far from being unnatural, this wakefulness was once completely normal? For much of history, people didn't sleep in one continuous stretch. Instead, they slept in 2 distinct phases, known today by historians as segmented sleep. It was a rhythm deeply shaped by natural light, daily life, and the quiet rituals of the night, and it makes the idea of sitting up in bed not only logical, but essential. Let's gently step into the past and explore what it meant to sleep in 2 halves, and how the hours in between became a time of mystery, reflection, and gentle wakefulness. First sleep and second sleep. In pre-industrial Europe, especially in the Middle Ages and early modern period, The most common pattern of sleep involved two main periods. People would go to bed shortly after nightfall, usually within a few hours of sunset. This was their first sleep, or dead sleep, as it was sometimes called. They would sleep for around 4 to 5 hours, then wake naturally, sometime between midnight and 2 o'clock in the morning. This waking period, known in some regions as the watch, might last an hour or more. Then, they would return to bed for their second sleep, which often lasted until sunrise. This segmented rhythm was not considered strange or problematic. On the contrary, it was an expected and even valued part of daily life. And during that quiet space between the two sleeps, something rather lovely happened. The midnight watch. This middle-of-the-night interval was a time of peace. The household was hushed, the outside world dark and still. Fires might be gently stoked, candles lit, and people would engage in activities that were often private, reflective, or quietly productive. Some people used the time for prayer or spiritual contemplation. In religious households, it was common to recite psalms, read devotional texts, or simply sit in silence and reflect. Others used the time for intimate conversation. In a world without phones or screens, the midnight hours allowed couples to speak quietly, to share thoughts, to connect in ways they couldn't during the busy daylight hours. Historical sources even suggest that this was a common time for marital relations, encouraged by some physicians as the most natural hour, when the body was rested but not yet stiff from sleep. In farming communities, people might quietly tend to small tasks, mending clothes, checking on animals, or preparing for the next day. Servants could slip out to complete chores, and some writers and thinkers claimed their most creative thoughts came during these still, middle hours. Crucially, people often remained sitting upright during this watchful time. They might sit on the edge of the bed, wrapped in a cloak, or lean against a pillow. Some simply stayed half-seated under the covers, never fully rising. The line between sleep and wakefulness was soft, more of a drift than a shift. Posture and practicality. Sleeping upright made segmented sleep easier. If one's body was already in a semi-seated position, it was less of a jolt to rise for the watch. No need to roll out from deep, horizontal slumber. You were already halfway there. For the elderly or infirm, or those who shared beds with others, this posture was also more convenient. Sitting up quietly disturbed fewer people and allowed for silent activity without fully waking a crowded room. In religious communities, the rhythm of sleep and posture was even more formalized. Monks, especially those in Benedictine monasteries, followed a strict schedule of night prayers, rising at set times for matins and lauds. Their sleep was divided not by preference, but by devotion. To make it easier, they often slept in chairs or stalls, in upright or reclining positions, cloaked in their robes and ready to respond to the bell. Lighting and timing. The lack of artificial light played a large part in shaping this segmented sleep. Once the sun had set and candles were burned low, darkness arrived swiftly. Most homes had little reason to stay awake past evening meals. Without gaslights or electric lamps, bedtime came early, often by 8 or 9 o'clock. But sunrise might not come until 6 or 7 in the morning. That left a long stretch of darkness. 10, even 12 hours. Far too much for most people to sleep straight through. Segmented sleep filled this time more naturally. 2 sleep periods, separated by an hour or 2 of wakefulness, made better use of the long nights. And it aligned more closely with the body's internal rhythm than the modern expectation of 8 hours straight. Many modern sleep researchers now believe that this older rhythm was actually more in tune with our circadian biology, the natural ebb and flow of alertness and fatigue governed by light and darkness. Echoes in literature and letters. Evidence of segmented sleep appears in numerous historical documents. In a 1594 medical text, physician André du Laurens describes how it was normal to rise after the first sleep and engage in light activities. In the Canterbury Tales, Geoffrey Chaucer hints at characters waking in the middle of the night. And in 17th century diaries and letters, references to first sleep and second sleep appear casually, suggesting it was common knowledge. Even in the 19th century, long after industrialization had begun, some rural areas and older households still maintained the tradition. A British doctor writing in 1850 noted, "It is quite usual among country people to awake at midnight, stir the fire, take a drink, and then lie down again. The disappearance of two sleeps. By the late 18th and early 19th centuries, however, this natural rhythm began to fade, especially in cities. The rise of street lighting, public clocks, and factory schedules gradually reshaped the night. People began staying up later, reading, socializing, working. Bedtime shifted later into the evening, and waking times became dictated by the needs of industrial labor rather than sunrise. The idea of 8 hours of uninterrupted sleep began to take root, promoted by reformers and eventually medical professionals. The space once held for gentle wakefulness shrank. Those who still woke in the night were told to see it as a problem, a symptom of stress or insomnia, rather than a natural phase. And yet, for many people, that instinct to rise in the night never entirely disappeared. A gentle memory. Even now, many of us wake briefly in the middle of the night and wonder why. We worry, check the clock, try to force ourselves back to sleep. But perhaps, in those quiet moments, we are simply echoing something very old. Perhaps our bodies remember the time when sleep came in 2 soft chapters, and between them, a page of stillness, upright rest, quiet thought, or whispered prayer. In that sense, the habit of sleeping sitting up, or reclining halfway, was never just about posture, it was about readiness. The readiness to rise, to reflect, and then, to drift gently back down into the soft, second sleep that waited on the other side of the firelight. Not all societies have shared the same idea of what it means to sleep properly. While much of Europe once embraced the habit of sleeping sitting up or at an angle, similar traditions can be found across other regions and times, each shaped by unique environments, beliefs, and daily routines. In fact, the idea of sleeping while fully horizontal is more modern and Western than we often realize. In many parts of the world, upright or semi-reclined sleep has long been common, and in some cases, it still is. China and the imperial court. In ancient China, especially among the nobility and imperial households, posture during sleep was taken seriously. Influenced by both Daoist philosophy and traditional Chinese medicine, sleeping flat on the back was discouraged. It was thought that energy, or qi, flowed through the body in specific channels. Sleeping too flat or in the wrong position could block this flow, leading to imbalance and illness. Instead, people were advised to rest on their side or in a slightly raised position, particularly when ill or elderly. In courtly environments, women were sometimes depicted reclining on day beds with wooden or silk cushions that supported the upper body. These were not strictly sleeping arrangements, but they blurred the lines between rest, sleep, and leisure. Upright rest became a sign of refinement, not only good for health, but also for posture and elegance. Japan and the art of minimalism. While Japan is famous for its minimalist futon-style sleeping on the floor, there have been periods in history when people preferred to sleep at an angle, particularly among Buddhist monks and samurai warriors. In Zen Buddhism, meditation is often practiced while sitting, and this seated stillness carried over into rest. Some monks would sleep in a lotus or cross-legged position, lightly dozing without fully reclining. This was done as part of mental discipline, a way to train the body not to indulge in heavy, sluggish sleep. Similarly, certain samurai were trained to rest lightly and in a seated position, often with their armor close by. Sleep was treated not as a surrender, but as a pause, one that must be entered carefully and without full vulnerability. Even for ordinary people, sleeping fully flat was not always ideal. Homes were small, mats were laid out on hard floors, and being able to sit up or lie at an angle helped conserve space, maintain warmth, and ease the strain of rising early. The Islamic world and prophetic guidance. In Islamic tradition, sleep posture has long held both spiritual and medical significance. The Prophet Muhammad is recorded in various hadiths, sayings, as sleeping on his right side, with his head slightly elevated. This practice, passed down through generations, became a model of restful, modest sleep. Many Muslims throughout history, and still today, sleep with a pillow under the head and the right hand under the cheek, in a posture that's partly reclined. It is seen as the healthiest and most spiritually mindful way to rest. Lying face down is discouraged, and long, flat sleep on the back can be viewed as too indulgent or even prideful. In many traditional Muslim households, particularly before the widespread use of Western-style beds. People would sleep on carpets or raised mats with bolsters. This encouraged a slightly inclined posture and allowed for easier transition between wakefulness and prayer, especially during the early morning hours. Africa's varied traditions. Across the African continent, sleeping practices have long reflected the climate, environment, and cultural values of different regions. In many communities, beds were not raised platforms but woven mats, placed on the floor or low frames. However, in some cultures, sleeping seated or propped up was part of daily routine, particularly for elders. Among the Ashanti of Ghana, for example, elder men and women were often given wooden headrests that allowed them to sleep on their side or back while keeping the head elevated. These were not just pillows. They were carefully carved objects that elevated the skull and neck, sometimes dramatically. They supported upright or angled sleeping, and also preserved elaborate hairstyles. Similarly, in East African coastal cultures, Swahili furniture included low wooden beds with intricately carved frames and sloping backs. These were often used as daybeds but could also support angled sleeping, especially in the heat of the afternoon when a siesta might be taken upright under a shaded veranda. Sleeping posture was often determined not only by comfort, but by social role. Chiefs, elders, or spiritual figures might rest in more upright positions to remain available for visitors or village matters, even during times of physical weakness or illness. South Asia and Ayurvedic views. In India and surrounding regions, Ayurvedic medicine has long influenced how and where people sleep. According to Ayurveda, posture during rest affects the body's doshas, the internal energies believed to govern health. Sleeping flat on the back was not recommended for everyone. For those with respiratory or digestive issues, sleeping elevated or on the left side was preferred, as it aided digestion and opened the airways. Slightly inclined beds or rolled blankets under the upper body were often used, particularly for pregnant women, the elderly, or those recovering from illness. In rural areas, sleeping outdoors in the heat was common, and people often rested upright against tree trunks or home walls to doze during the day. The division between sleep, rest, and meditation was more fluid, and upright postures were seen as protective, especially against insects, heat, and unexpected visitors. Nomadic cultures and practical postures. For many nomadic groups, from Mongolian herders to Bedouin tribes, upright or semi-upright sleeping was part of a practical lifestyle. In harsh climates or open-air camps, it wasn't always safe to lie down fully. People often slept wrapped in cloaks or rugs, sitting upright against packs or saddles, prepared to rise quickly if needed. Even when tents or yurts were used, sleeping at an angle was common, not out of preference, but out of necessity. In windy deserts or freezing plains, keeping the body coiled and upright helped preserve warmth. A full horizontal sprawl was not always possible, nor was it always wise. A shared thread. Across cultures, sleeping upright or reclined has meant different things. Sometimes a matter of health, sometimes spiritual discipline, and sometimes simply the most practical way to rest in a given environment. What these traditions all share is the idea that sleep is not just biological, it is cultural. How we sleep reflects what we believe about the body, the soul, and the night. In the West, flat beds have become the standard. But elsewhere, the habit of resting at an angle, of sitting up slightly in the silence of the night, remains alive in practice or memory. And perhaps, when we find ourselves dozing in a chair or sitting upright in bed with a pillow behind our back, we are not being restless or strange. We are simply echoing a practice that has, in one form or another, always been with us. Not all societies have shared the same idea of what it means to sleep properly. While much of Europe once embraced the habit of sleeping sitting up or at an angle, similar traditions can be found across other regions and times, each shaped by unique environments, beliefs, and daily routines. In fact, the idea of sleeping while fully horizontal is more modern and Western than we often realize. In many parts of the world, upright or semi-reclined sleep has long been common, and in some cases, it still is. China and the imperial court. In ancient China, especially among the nobility and imperial households, posture during sleep was taken seriously. Influenced by both Daoist philosophy and traditional Chinese medicine, sleeping flat on the back was discouraged. It was thought that energy, or qi, flowed through the body in specific channels. Sleeping too flat or in the wrong position could block this flow, leading to imbalance and illness. Instead, people were advised to rest on their side or in a slightly raised position, particularly when ill or elderly. In courtly environments, women were sometimes depicted reclining on day beds with wooden or silk cushions that supported the upper body. These were not strictly sleeping arrangements, but they blurred the lines between rest, sleep, and leisure. Upright rest became a sign of refinement, not only good for health, but also for posture and elegance. Japan and the art of minimalism. While Japan is famous for its minimalist futon-style sleeping on the floor, there have been periods in history when people preferred to sleep at an angle, particularly among Buddhist monks and samurai warriors. In Zen Buddhism, meditation is often practiced while sitting, and this seated stillness carried over into rest. Some monks would sleep in a lotus or cross-legged position, lightly dozing without fully reclining. This was done as part of mental discipline, a way to train the body not to indulge in heavy, sluggish sleep. Similarly, certain samurai were trained to rest lightly and in a seated position, often with their armor close by. Sleep was treated not as a surrender, but as a pause, one that must be entered carefully and without full vulnerability. Even for ordinary people, sleeping fully flat was not always ideal. Homes were small, mats were laid out on hard floors, and being able to sit up or lie at an angle helped conserve space, maintain warmth, and ease the strain of rising early. The Islamic world and prophetic guidance. In Islamic tradition, sleep posture has long held both spiritual and medical significance. The Prophet Muhammad is recorded in various hadiths, sayings, as sleeping on his right side, with his head slightly elevated. This practice, passed down through generations, became a model of restful, modest sleep. Many Muslims throughout history, and still today, sleep with a pillow under the head and the right hand under the cheek, in a posture that's partly reclined. It is seen as the healthiest and most spiritually mindful way to rest. Lying face down is discouraged, and long, flat sleep on the back can be viewed as too indulgent or even prideful. In many traditional Muslim households, particularly before the widespread use of Western-style beds, people would sleep on carpets or raised mats with bolsters. This encouraged a slightly inclined posture and allowed for easier transition between wakefulness and prayer, especially during the early morning hours. Africa's varied traditions. Across the African continent, sleeping practices have long reflected the climate, environment, and cultural values of different regions. In many communities, beds were not raised platforms but woven mats, placed on the floor or low frames. However, in some cultures, sleeping seated or propped up was part of daily routine, particularly for elders. Among the Ashanti of Ghana, for example, elder men and women were often given wooden headrests that allowed them to sleep on their side or back while keeping the head elevated. These were not just pillows. They were carefully carved objects that elevated the skull and neck, sometimes dramatically. They supported upright or angled sleeping, and also preserved elaborate hairstyles. Similarly, in East African coastal cultures, Swahili furniture included low wooden beds with intricately carved frames and sloping backs. These were often used as daybeds but could also support angled sleeping, especially in the heat of the afternoon when a siesta might be taken upright under a shaded veranda. Sleeping posture was often determined not only by comfort, but by social role. Chiefs, elders, or spiritual figures might rest in more upright positions to remain available for visitors or village matters, even during times of physical weakness or illness. South Asia and Ayurvedic views. In India and surrounding regions, Ayurvedic medicine has long influenced how and where people sleep. According to Ayurveda, posture during rest affects the body's doshas, the internal energies believed to govern health. Sleeping flat on the back was not recommended for everyone. For those with respiratory or digestive issues, sleeping elevated or on the left side was preferred, as it aided digestion and opened the airways. Slightly inclined beds or rolled blankets under the upper body were often used, particularly for pregnant women, the elderly, or those recovering from illness. In rural areas, sleeping outdoors in the heat was common, and people often rested upright against tree trunks or home walls to doze during the day. The division between sleep, rest, and meditation was more fluid, and upright postures were seen as protective, especially against insects, heat, and unexpected visitors. Nomadic cultures and practical postures. For many nomadic groups, from Mongolian herders to Bedouin tribes, upright or semi-upright sleeping was part of a practical lifestyle. In harsh climates or open-air camps, it wasn't always safe to lie down fully. People often slept wrapped in cloaks or rugs, sitting upright against packs or saddles, prepared to rise quickly if needed. Even when tents or yurts were used, sleeping at an angle was common, not out of preference, but out of necessity. In windy deserts or freezing plains, keeping the body coiled and upright helped preserve warmth. A full horizontal sprawl was not always possible, nor was it always wise. A shared thread. Across cultures, sleeping upright or reclined has meant different things. Sometimes a matter of health, sometimes spiritual discipline, and sometimes simply the most practical way to rest in a given environment. What these traditions all share is the idea that sleep is not just biological, it is cultural. How we sleep reflects what we believe about the body, the soul, and the night. In the West, flat beds have become the standard. But elsewhere, the habit of resting at an angle, of sitting up slightly in the silence of the night, remains alive in practice or memory. And perhaps, when we find ourselves dozing in a chair or sitting upright in bed with a pillow behind our back, we are not being restless or strange. We are simply echoing a practice that has, in one form or another, always been with us. Chapter 7. The Decline of Upright Sleeping. 1000 words, calm, UK English, sleep-friendly tone. By the 19th century, the old habit of sleeping upright had begun to fade. Slowly but surely, the image of someone dozing propped against cushions or sitting upright in a box bed gave way to something more familiar to us today. The image of a person lying fully horizontal in a soft, deep bed, wrapped in blankets, eyes closed for an uninterrupted night's rest. But how did this shift happen? And why did people stop sleeping the way they had for hundreds of years? The story is not about one single moment of change. Rather, it is about a quiet transformation in culture, medicine, technology, and timekeeping, each playing its part in redefining what a proper night's sleep looked like. Industrialization and the regulation of time. One of the most powerful forces behind the change was industrialization. As factories spread across Britain and later Europe and North America, the structure of daily life was altered. For the first time, large numbers of people were expected to rise and report for work at set hours, often early in the morning. This new system placed pressure on workers to sleep efficiently. The idea of sleeping in two parts, or waking for a couple of hours in the middle of the night, began to seem impractical, even irresponsible. Rest became a means of fueling productivity. A full night of uninterrupted sleep, lying flat from late evening until early morning, became the ideal. It was in this period that the 8-hour sleep model first emerged, one part of a new vision of life divided into 3 neat sections: 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, and 8 hours for leisure. As this idea spread, the older rhythms of rest, which had made room for sitting up, midnight watches, and slow transitions, began to disappear. The invention of modern beds and mattresses. Another major change came in the physical structure of the bed itself. By the 19th century, beds were no longer wooden frames with ropes or hay-stuffed mattresses. Instead, they became metal-framed, often with sprung bases, and were topped with softer, more uniform mattresses made from wool, cotton, or horsehair. These new beds were not designed for sitting up. They encouraged the body to lie fully flat. In fact, the whole experience of getting into bed was reimagined. Whereas earlier generations might have climbed into a curtained bed in a shared space, modern sleepers entered a private bedroom, pulled up thick duvets or quilts, and settled into a posture more like what we expect today: horizontal, comfortable, still. Bed design began to reflect modern ideas of comfort and health. Headboards became less angled. Pillows became softer, more numerous, and decorative. Bolsters, once used to prop up the body, began to vanish. No longer considered necessary, they were replaced by the notion that a good bed allowed you to lie completely down and remain that way until morning. Medical shifts and scientific sleep. The field of medicine also changed dramatically in this period. Older beliefs about the humors, vapors, and bodily energies gave way to scientific study of anatomy, physiology, and eventually, neurology. Doctors no longer warned of phlegm rising into the brain or demons pressing on the chest. Instead, they began to speak in terms of circulation, nervous health, and restorative sleep cycles. Lying flat was now seen as good for the spine and lungs. Medical professionals promoted the idea that uninterrupted, deep sleep was the best way to support both physical and mental well-being. Sleep itself began to be studied as a natural biological process. By the early 20th century, researchers were observing brainwaves and sleep stages. Sleep became something to be measured, improved, even optimized. In this environment, sitting up in bed came to be seen not as wise or cautious, but as awkward, uncomfortable, or even unhealthy. If a person was sleeping upright, it was usually because they were sick, not because they were following tradition. The rise of personal bedrooms. Privacy also played a significant role. In earlier times, sleeping arrangements were often communal. Families might share a single bed, or sleep in close proximity to servants, children, or guests. In this context, sleeping partially upright offered modesty and space. It made sense to remain covered, seated, and alert, even in sleep. But in the 19th and early 20th centuries, the private bedroom became the norm, especially in the middle and upper classes. Sleeping became a solitary or spousal activity, conducted in comfort and behind closed doors. There was no longer any social reason to stay upright. There were no watchful visitors, no children sharing the covers, no need to keep an eye on the fire or the door. With privacy came the luxury of fully reclining, to stretch out, dream deeply, and sleep without interruption. Changing attitudes to nighttime. Attitudes to the night also changed. With the arrival of gaslighting and later electricity, cities were no longer governed by the sun. People could stay awake later, reading, writing, entertaining, and the natural rhythm of early to bed, early to rise began to shift. As night became lighter and more active, sleep became compressed. There was less time for a two-part structure. People wanted to fall asleep quickly and wake refreshed. The old midnight watch, once a gentle time of reflection or work, became a strange and unwelcome disruption. People who found themselves waking in the night, as their ancestors had, now began to worry. Was this insomnia? A health issue? A nervous condition? Something that needed correcting? In truth, it was likely just the echo of an older rhythm, one that no longer fit in the modern world. Modern sleeping norms and furniture. By the 20th century, the upright sleeper had all but vanished from public view. Furniture followed suit. Reclining chairs, adjustable beds, and daybeds remained popular, but were no longer associated with everyday sleep. Instead, they were used for rest, illness, or reading, not the night's main slumber. Hospitals continued to elevate patients for respiratory care. Pregnant women were still advised to rest at an incline. But for the average person, sleep meant lying flat, preferably for 8 uninterrupted hours. To sleep upright, outside of medical need, was now seen as a quirk, a remnant of old age, anxiety, or eccentricity. A quiet vanishing. And so, over the course of a century or two, the ancient habit of sleeping sitting up quietly disappeared from ordinary life. The sloped bed gave way to the soft mattress. The midnight watch became a problem to be solved. And the posture of sleep, once debated, protected, and ritualized, became uniform. Today, when someone props themselves up on pillows to sleep, it is often met with concern. Are they unwell? Is something wrong? But perhaps, deep in the subconscious, it is something older stirring, the memory of how humans once slept, not all at once, not all the way down, but half in, half out of the waking world. A way of sleeping that matched the rhythm of firelight, stars, and thought. Though long considered old-fashioned or even odd, the habit of sleeping while sitting up has never disappeared entirely. In fact, in recent years, it has quietly resurfaced, not as a relic of medieval belief or monastic discipline, but as a response to very modern problems. Across bedrooms, hospitals, airports, and long journeys, people continue to sleep in seated or inclined positions. And in a world of sleep disorders, snoring, acid reflux, and aching backs, sleeping upright is being reconsidered, not as a curiosity, but as a potential solution. In many ways, we are rediscovering what our ancestors already knew, that sleep is not one size fits all, and that sometimes, sitting up is the most restful way to let the body and mind restore themselves. Medical reasons for upright sleep. One of the most common modern reasons for sleeping upright is health. Medical professionals today recommend an inclined posture for people suffering from several conditions. For instance, those with acid reflux or gastroesophageal reflux disease, GORD, are often advised to raise the upper body during sleep. Lying flat can allow stomach acid to travel upwards into the esophagus, causing discomfort and disturbed sleep. By sleeping at an angle, usually around 30 to 45 degrees, gravity helps keep acid in the stomach where it belongs. Similarly, people with sleep apnea often benefit from sleeping in a semi-upright position. Apnea causes the airway to collapse or become blocked during sleep, leading to pauses in breathing. Lying flat can make this worse, while sitting up opens the airway and reduces pressure on the throat. People recovering from surgery, particularly abdominal or heart procedures, may also be instructed to sleep inclined. It reduces strain on stitches, supports breathing, and can lessen swelling. Those with congestive heart failure, COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, or asthma may find that sleeping fully reclined increases fluid in the lungs or leads to shortness of breath. In these cases, propped or upright sleep is not a preference, it's essential. Pregnancy and comfort. Pregnant women, especially in the third trimester, often find lying flat uncomfortable. The weight of the growing uterus can press on major blood vessels, cause back pain, and lead to shortness of breath. Many mothers-to-be instinctively shift to sleeping upright or use a series of pillows to recline at an angle. This echoes ancient advice. In many historical cultures, pregnant women were told to avoid lying flat for long periods. Today, medical advice supports the same posture, and many women find that semi-sitting sleep is the only way to rest comfortably. Furniture that supports upright sleep. The furniture market has responded to these modern needs with a wide array of options designed for elevated rest. Adjustable beds, once only found in hospitals, are now common in homes. They allow users to raise the head and legs at the touch of a button. This can support people with medical needs, but also appeals to anyone who prefers reading, watching TV, or dozing in a slightly upright position. Recliners and zero-gravity chairs, originally designed for astronauts, are now used for sleep in homes, care facilities, and during travel. These chairs distribute weight evenly, relieve pressure on the spine, and are especially popular among older adults or those with chronic pain. For those on the move, travel pillows and neck supports have become essential for catching sleep on planes, trains, and coaches. In fact, in airports and waiting rooms across the world, people routinely fall asleep sitting upright, curled in chairs, nodding gently in rhythm with the hum of engines or the murmur of strangers. While these might not be examples of ideal, long-term sleep, they prove something important. Humans can still sleep upright, and often do. Sleep disorders and the return of custom sleep. The rise of sleep science in the last few decades has revealed how varied and complex human rest can be. While the 8 hours flat model still dominates public thinking, it doesn't work for everyone. People with insomnia may find that sitting up helps reduce anxiety. Those who suffer from nightmares, claustrophobia, or panic attacks sometimes feel safer and more in control when they sleep in a chair or a slightly raised position. People with certain forms of autism or sensory processing disorder also report more comfort when sleeping upright. Some elderly people, especially those who wake frequently or suffer from stiffness, choose to nap in recliners or remain semi-seated in bed throughout the night. It allows them to doze lightly, wake gently, and shift position without too much effort. These habits are often seen as adaptive, not signs of disorder, but practical responses to changing bodies and personal needs. Cultural practices still alive. Outside the Western world, many communities continue to use non-flat sleeping arrangements. In parts of Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, beds may be angled slightly, or consist of mats and bolsters that naturally encourage inclined rest. In rural areas, sleeping in chairs, hammocks, or on firm benches remains common, particularly during heat or illness. Some religious communities still embrace upright rest as part of discipline or devotion. In Buddhist monasteries, monks sometimes meditate through the night in seated posture, drifting in and out of light sleep. In these cases, sleep remains intentional, conscious, and dignified, reframing what's normal. The modern world is slowly learning to let go of rigid definitions of sleep. More doctors and sleep specialists now recognize that sleep does not need to follow one formula. Segmented sleep is being studied again. Upright sleep is gaining attention. And rest is being understood not just as horizontal silence, but as whatever posture supports your body, mind, and spirit. For some, this means returning to what was once normal, a slightly inclined posture, a second sleep in the early hours, or even a full night spent dozing gently upright. It's not strange. It's not new. It's simply human. Now that we are concluding on how people slept in history, the way we sleep has changed many times. But the core truth remains: sleep is not just about comfort. It is about safety, rhythm, and balance. Our ancestors slept sitting up not because they didn't know better, but because they were responding to the world around them. They listened to their bodies, feared their demons, trusted their doctors, and adapted their furniture accordingly. And now, centuries later, some of us are doing the same, reaching for another pillow, raising the head of the bed, or slipping into a chair when rest doesn't come any other way. Not out of superstition, just out of instinct. Because sometimes, when you can't lie down, or don't want to, it's perfectly fine to sit up and rest. And in that upright stillness, under soft light or silent stars, perhaps you'll find what so many before you have found. Sleep, gentle, steady, and kind, waiting patiently just above the pillow. Good night.